Lynn Picknett and Clive friends, welcome to Bendiksen Airways.
Thank you very much.
Hello, thank you for having us on.
My pleasure. What are the chances that we have descendants of Jesus living among us today?
Not very many. Well, either not very many chances or millions upon millions of chances. Because, by the laws of heredity, really. I mean, if Jesus and Mary Magdalene had children, then by now the bloodline will be so diluted as to be meaningless. So, so there's that. But we don't know for certain that they did have children in the first place.
Yeah, but if they, so, well, like I said, either the chances there were lots of them, or none at all. But the important point is when you start talking about bloodlines, and the bloodline, the holy bloodline, that's the part that really doesn't stand up. I mean, we have had so many people come up to us at when we're doing conferences or doing phone-ins, saying that people phone up saying we are of the bloodline, and our reaction is always and what does that mean? Because as most of you will know, the whole bloodline idea really came from the book The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail back in 1982, and that the whole bloodline thing has taken on a life of its own. And I think a lot of people don't realise that the whole point of that, or the significance of the bloodline, according to that theory, it's nothing to do with genetics or anything like that. It's purely to do with what you might call legal laws of inheritance. That certain titles and rights and privileges are passed down the bloodline, as they do in a royal family. So it's not that they're not saying that there was anything special about that bloodline in terms of its genetics or biology. They were just saying that they had certain inherited rights and privileges, and of course the fact that if Jesus had children, it would completely upset the conventional Christian idea of this, the celibate Son of God. So, in fact, the real thing about the real point of the Holy Bloodline theory is to show that there wasn't anything special about any of them, including the person that started it all. That he was just a mortal man.
Yeah, and there's also a very dubious undertone to all of this talk of, as Clive said, we get so many people cropping up saying, oh, I'm a Merovingian, or I'm, this and that. And as Clive said, it's kind of even if it's true, which it usually isn't, I say so, because, and obviously the implication is that they're superior to the rest of us because of their assumed genetics. That they have these amazing genes that makes them special, almost holy, and they don't seem to either realize, or if they do care, the implication of that, which as mid 20th century history certainly showed, the minute you start either demonizing a group of people because of their genetics, or elevating another group of people because of their genetics, all hell breaks loose. I mean, it's really bad news for everybody to have that mindset. So, but people just don't get that. They love, oh, I'm a Merovingian. Look at me, I'm great.
Well, I'm descended from Jesus and Mary Magdalene.
Oh, yes. Well, prove it, mate, for a start. But yeah.
So, now you can tell we're a little sceptical about
just a little bit.
The interesting thing for us is not if there was, not is the bloodline still around today, but did it start in the first place? Basically, did Jesus and Mary Magdalene get it together?
I mean, You know, obviously because of the Gnostic Gospels, which we're quite big on, they did very heavy implication, if not actually spelled out, is that they were in a very close physical relationship. And, you know, given the likelihood of that giving rise to a child, yes, you know, they might have done, let's put it that way, they might have had a child. But the thing that most people don't seem to realize is that had they had a child and had it lived, then it would have been mentioned. It would have been part of the Christian story. And Jesus would not have been a celibate. He would have been a Jewish priest who had a child, you know. But also, I mean, Jesus's relatives are mentioned in the, well, certainly his brother James is mentioned in the records as being the first Archbishop of Jerusalem. So we know about his blood relatives, but in that story there is no mention of a child. So I mean, there's no actual evidence for this. It's speculation, and it's a kind of airy-fairy New Age story, really. But I mean, you know, there should be nothing against the idea. You know, he couldn't possibly have a child. You know, I mean, they might have had, but it looks like that child, if there was one or maybe there were more, they didn't survive because they would have been in the record.
Yeah. But you can certainly see why that theory kind of grabbed people's imaginations, you know, and then led on to so many other books that followed that up, because it is an exciting idea. It's just, you look into it too deeply, it doesn't really stand up. But anyway.
Before we continue down this road, how would you introduce yourself?
Oh.
We try not.
Well, we're not Merovingians, I'll tell you that. Yeah, we're not first. Yeah,
and they're not great gurus or teachers.
No.
We usually describe ourselves as historical detectives or investigators. We don't call ourselves historians because we don't, have the academic qualifications. We have the abilities, but we don't have that. And we don't call ourselves theologians.
Oh, no, absolutely not.
But we're more, we see ourselves more as the equivalent of investigative reporters, so investigative historians. Yeah. We kind of look at the bits that other people either miss or join dots that other people haven't. And we try and take a very open-minded look at everything, which is kind of a mixture of being open to all ideas and also being skeptical of all positions at the same time.
Well, sort of cynical, really. Yeah. Sort of take a step back and look at things, hopefully with an objective eye, and also hopefully along the path. If we get something wrong, we admit it. I mean, we are fact-based and evidence-based wherever possible, but we like to think that where we do speculate, we make it very obvious that's what we're doing in our books. So that the reader doesn't confuse our imaginings or our speculation with the facts. Because, we've read so many books where you don't really know what's going on with the point, the point of contact with the reader. You don't really know what's going on.
And a lot of these subjects, particularly when you're talking about, the story behind the New Testament and what really happened, there are so many gaps that everybody has to speculate, including, the New Testament scholars. There's always a bit where you have to say, well, there's a question here, we don't understand, we'll take this point of view, and if we're right, then these things follow. So it's unavoidable. So we would never say that everything we've done is like 100% proven, because you can't say that even about the conventional interpretations of the story.
You can't even say that about straightforward history, let alone this sort of thing.
But there are points where you can say, things that are, presented as proven facts are not 100% proven. So
yes, because one of our strengths is to go, because it's in an awful lot of trouble over the years, but is to go over the claims of other researchers or other writers or authorities on subjects and check their evidence, check their facts. And you would be surprised at what is missing or is wrong, you know. But as I say, it's got us into, you know, quite a bit of problems over the years doing that. But yeah, that's what that we have done that.
Yeah. Must be fascinating, interesting to do this, work on this.
It is. And, you know, there's two of us, so it's not as lonely as being a sole writer, you know. But actually we keep each other going. So, you know.
Sane. Well, sane-ish.
Yeah, same, yeah, well, yeah. I mean, yes.
So if you were to indulge me, how do you view the coming of the New Testament, the story there? How much cherry picking are we talking about when it was put together?
In the conventional
New Testament,
the conventional narrative,
Yeah.
a lot, because it's like everything. It's probably impossible for anybody to write to write a story if they're trying to look at it from a point of view of a religion or set of beliefs, and not cherry pick to present the image they want. And I mean, we essentially look upon the New Testament Gospels as basically propaganda for a new religion. And that's why the story has been cherry picked. You know, inconvenient facts are left out, and convenient facts are emphasized and occasionally invented.
Well, yes, sorry. It's just that you know, the whole nativity story, which, I mean, was obviously invented, you know, with the whole, you know, the three kings, you know, the stable, the shepherds, the star, you know, all of that, and the special gifts. I mean, that is obviously taken from the stories of other dying and rising gods, such as, you know, Osiris in Egypt, you know, who was born in a cave, you know, in one of the stories, one of his origin stories, you know, and then there's other origin stories of the other dying and rising gods, which would have been known to the writers of the New Testament. I mean, for example, Tammuz, one of the great dying and rising gods, every year in Jerusalem there was a festival to Tammuz. So, you know, I mean, the local people would have absorbed a bit of information about the worship of that god and the story of that god. So, I mean, the thing was that obviously the writers of the New Testament, whoever they were, because they certainly weren't Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you know, I mean, that's one of the annoying things about it. But they obviously didn't know much about Jesus. I mean, after all, Jesus never wrote a word himself. And it was all sort of very much secondhand. And they had this gap, you know. He must have been born somewhere. He must have done something, you know, in that time, and you know, before he suddenly appears in his ministry. So we're going to create an amazing story for him, but we're going to pluck it from other myths and legends.
Yeah, and also in the case of Matthew's Gospel, make the story fit Old Testament prophecies of the Messiah, which is where the discrepancies between his and Luke's telling come from. So there's always an agenda, and it's probably impossible for anyone to write, particularly, you know, in that kind of area in religious terms, without bias creeping in.
Well, also,
or without filling the gaps with what you want to be true.
Well, yeah, I mean, and the absolute classic was that the original New Testament Gospel, Mark, ends without a resurrection. It ends, you know, there's no virgin birth and there's no resurrection. So the two classic things that Christianity based on, especially the resurrection, just doesn't happen in it. And most people don't even notice that, because they've got it in the other Gospels, so it's sort of a bit of a mess in their minds. It's all swirling around. But it just because the people at the time didn't know that Jesus was supposed to have been resurrected. I mean, because presumably he wasn't.
In the sense that it's taught now that he physically resurrected and interacted with people. Because they had a thing of people being raised up to heaven, and that was the Mark's Gospel ends with discovering the tomb empty and the body missing, and that's enough. Because it'd be like some of the Old Testament figures that were taken up. It was only later that they suddenly thought, oh no, we need more than this. We need him to actually have been seen and interacted with people. So it's and just to sort of add that what Lynn just said about Mark's Gospel, a lot of people were saying, but Mark's Gospel does have the appearances of the resurrection in it. It does now, but I can't remember which century it was. We look at any Bible written before a certain point in Christian history, and the Bible just stops with the women running from the tomb to go and tell the people that the body is gone. Then at some point somebody realized this was a bit of a giveaway, so that suddenly it's tacked on in a completely different style, an adaptation of the story as told. I think it's in Luke. So now they will conform nicely, but the very first one, and the thing is, at the time that Gospel was written, the tomb being empty would have been miraculous enough for them. It's just as time went on, for that first generation of Christians, it was or his followers. But as time went on, it was kind of, well, somebody could have just stolen the body. You need to fill that gap.
Well, I mean, at risk of being very, very irreverent, I mean, it's almost like an Agatha Christie, isn't it? It ends with a disappearance of a body. And that's it. You get no information. It's just who what happened. So I mean, that's a story in itself. But yeah, I mean, that's the dying and rising gods. Osiris dying, and then not in his case, he was chopped into bits, but he was reassembled 3 days later. And the other dying and rising gods, it was 2 or 3 days after they died, they arose again. And there were even stories about the Emperor Nero, after he died, being seen walking around the streets of Rome. So it was in people's minds,
And in fact, we think, I mean, it's something we mention in our books, but we've come to realize actually probably even more significant was the Nero tales, because of course Nero was the emperor that was the first persecutor of Christians. And then when he died, as Lynn said, there were stories that he was still around. And in fact, there are even stories that he was raising an army somewhere to actually make a comeback. And he was actually known as Nero the Latin for the resurrected Nero. So you can actually see the process going through in the early Christian's mind, is that this is our great persecutor. He's supposed to have come back from the dead. We can do better than that, So did our hero. So then they take the original story, which I said earlier, that would have been miraculous enough that the tomb was empty and he had been raised up to heaven. But now they needed something to compete with Nero's story, and so they come up with stories of Jesus having been seen, completely contradictory stories. I mean, blatantly contradictory at points. They can't actually be, they can't be true. To put it another way, only one of them can be true because they contradict each other. It's more than likely none of them are true, and it all ended with the discovery of the empty tomb, which we think the evidence does support the fact that Jesus was crucified, put in a tomb, and it was then found to be empty. But at that time, and in the Roman world generally, not even exclusively to Judaism, the people being raised up to the heavens from their tomb was actually a very standard part of the culture, not being seen in between. They were put in the tomb and it's found to be empty. There were all kinds of stories about figures that happened to.
And also Mary Magdalene in the garden, encountering the risen Jesus. Of course, she was the first person, which of course to have done so, which is very important. But her words in the New Testament, they've taken my Lord, I know not where they've laid him. And the dialogue with the so-called gardener, who was of course Jesus. That's almost word for word from the Osiris mystery plays in Egypt, when Isis goes looking for his body. So, I mean, that's another absorption of pagan myth.
Yeah, and it was also a standard sort of theme in Greek and Roman stories of the time of the lover, which is the significant bit there, the story of the lover going in search of their beloved and meeting them in a garden. So there's a lot of fictionalizing, shall we say, in those stories.
But I mean, in those days, there wasn't much of a concept of fiction being different from non-fiction, if you like. It was all writing. It was all stuff that was put out by writers, and they were given equal weight. The fiction and the non-fiction was somehow given equal weight. And in the case of the Gospels, they sort of run together, and they certainly don't say when they're speculating. They present it as just as factual as the very few actual facts in the New Testament.
Yeah. And probably the important thing in all that we've been saying is that once you widen the context, when people talk about the Gospels, they're only talking about them in terms of Christian faith and Christian theology. When you widen out to what else was going on in that world at that time, and then you start to see where the borrowings happened, either deliberate borrowings from myth or just telling a story that fits into the expectations of the time, that appear unique when it's read out in church or something, but you actually realize there was many similar stories going around about other people in all different kind of religions around them. So,
is there any dispute of Jesus even having lived?
Well, there's a dispute about it, but we don't agree with the dispute. I mean, yes, from time to time you get people. I mean, it's been going on for decades, but it's like all these things. There's a new generation discovering the question as if they're the first generation. But I mean, it's been around for a long time. Did Jesus even exist? And interestingly, one of the reasons put forward for him is non-existence was that his story was so pagan. His story was so full of pagan elements that we've been talking about. But that doesn't have to fit at all, because, as we say, the writers had no real concept then anyway of not mixing fiction and non-fiction, and they were shameless in just plucking bits of stories of gods and putting them in. And as I say, it was clear. It's clear when you analyze the stories that not much that was actually factual was known about Jesus. He was their great hero, and they wanted to memorialize him in books, which they did, of course, very successfully. But there's not actually much that you can get your teeth into about him. But having said that, it's clear he did exist. I mean, presumably not remotely like Christians believe. I mean, he was nothing like that. But I mean, one of the things is, I mean, yes, he's not mentioned in independent contemporary documentation, because he wasn't important enough when he was alive. You know, and this is something that Christians find very, very hard to understand, but actually he just wasn't. He was one of many would-be Christs that Pontius Pilate put to death, you know, in Jerusalem, for, you know, insurgency, basically. I mean, but the interesting thing is,
so he was a militant.
well, he was. Pontius Pilate saw him as being an agitator, or at least somebody around whom dangerous crowds might grow. It's difficult, you see. Like so many things about Jesus are contradictory. You know, I mean, in his own words, people say, "Oh, well, he was the Prince of Peace," but then he said, "I come not to bring peace, but a sword." You know, and I mean, certainly the Jewish Messiah, or the Christ, as it in the Greek, Christos, was believed to be a military leader who would come and free the people, and in that case, from the Romans. It was obvious who he was supposed to free them from. And you know, did Jesus actually fit that hope? Really? Well, maybe up to a point. You know, maybe up to a point. I mean, there are clues, there are hints that there was a kind of a military element to it. But by the time you get to the crucifixion, it seems that, well, obviously, you know, you couldn't have a hero suffering, you know, a common criminal's death. So by then, presumably, he'd lost any army or masses of followers that he had. But the thing about, so Jesus, you know, did or didn't exist, shall we say? But we know that John the Baptist existed because he is in, you know, quite a bit of independent, nearly contemporary documentation, and also Saint Peter and Saint Paul, because they crop up in history in other ways. So, you know, so those are three men who we are led to believe anyway, whose whole life was about Jesus. So, you know, I mean, what were they doing? You know, yeah, I mean, you know, so the bottom line is we believe Jesus did exist. He wasn't anything like Christians believe. He wasn't important in his day at all. And it's just that his followers basically got lucky with an accident of history, that their books have come down to us and their religions come down to us, you know, hugely successfully. But he did exist. He did exist.
It is something that we, it's kind of almost a theme in our work, in all the different kind of things we write about, of sort of standing between it's kind of extreme sort of binary thinking in subjects. So, for example, you know, on the Jesus debate, you kind of get this extreme of either Jesus existed and every word written about him in the Gospels is true, or he never existed at all. And you're thinking, well, you know, the truth is somewhere in between. Yes, he really existed, but stories were made up about him, just as they made up stories about Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar and things. It happens inevitably with any famous figure or any figure that's important to a group of people, that folklore grows up around them.
I mean, Elvis is still alive.
Yeah,
Elvis is still alive. You know, so yeah.
He must be old by now. It's you know, we always kind of find in what we're doing is the truth is between those two extremes of complete black and complete white about things. And then, you know, it's almost the way we look at everything. You know? But
sadly, today, people are, in general, about almost anything, are hugely polarized. And nuance is dead, basically, you know. And we campaign to bring it back, you know. You have to sort of calm down and think everything out, rather than just taking a very polarized position.
Yeah. We should invent a new philosophy called nuancism.
Nuancism, yes. I'm the high priestess. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Tell me about the Shroud of Turin.
Oh, where to begin?
It's where we began.
That's where we began. Yes, yes.
Yes. Well, most people know what the Shroud of Turin is.
Supposed to be.
It's the cloth bearing an image, an inexplicable image of supposedly Jesus, or what is supposed to be Jesus. And the mystery had always been explaining how that image got on there, because it's not artistic, it's not painted, it's not created by any known technique. And the argument would be, because you can't explain the image, it must therefore be genuine. It must actually be a relic of the resurrection. That was Christ's burial shroud, in which, when he resurrected, his image was captured on it. And so that's where we started. It was just, a whole strange lot of circumstances. This is back at the beginning of the 1980s, when we first knew each other.
Late 80s.
So late 80s.
Yeah, we met in the late 80s.
Late 80s.
That was me. That was me you met then. But yes, well, we started when the shroud had been carbon dated.
Yes,
yeah,
that's it. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was in 1988 they finally carbon dated the cloth of the shroud and found out it was medieval, basically. And so everyone said, "Oh, it's a fake." That's it. And us being the kind that we are, when everybody went off it, we got interested. So we just, but there was a whole lot of other strange circumstances that kind of drew us into that.
Yeah. But I mean, we'd been interested in the shroud before the carbon dating. I mean, not from a religious perspective at all, but just how remarkable and unexplained it was. In fact, I worked on a publication called The Unexplained, and we did features on it, and I would look at them and think, oh, this is amazing. Because, I mean, certainly the only people who were interested in it then were the believers, were the people who thought it was Jesus's winding sheet. But nevertheless, it was fascinating. And when it was carbon dated, I mean, interrupting myself, but what was really very telling was that the reason, one of the main reasons it was allowed to be carbon dated was that there'd been a very vociferous lobby from the believers who were so convinced that science could prove it and get the whole world, to believe in the shroud. And then, of course, the irony was that the carbon dating came back and said, well, no, it's not Jesus's, it couldn't possibly be Jesus's winding sheet. And at that point, a good many of them said, well, you're wrong then. You can't be right.
Yeah,
carbon dating's rubbish. Yeah. So So at that point, that was when we thought, look, it doesn't detract. None of this detracts from the fact that the image is amazing. It's not a painting. It's, as Clive said, it's not obviously anything, and it looks like a crucified man, especially in photographic negative when it sort of leaps into life. I mean, quite startlingly so. But the thing is, there were two. We used to go to meetings of the believers, but obviously public meetings, and time after time after time they would use two phrases. One was, if it's a fake, and obviously they didn't believe it was, but they say, if it's a fake, it must have been created by some unknown Leonardo da Vinci. The second phrase that they would always use was, the image behaves like a photograph. So we set ourselves, talk about being hugely over-ambitious, to say the least. We set ourselves a task, which was, and we set ourselves a task to publishers who, had come forward, it's a long story, but come forward and asked us if we'd got a book about it. We said, well, we could have, So we promised that we'd find out who did it and how. Yeah, well, you've got to make a splash with publishing. But anyway, but the thing was, we had these two phrases from the believers, some unknown Leonardo and behaves like a photograph. So we thought, well, we'll start by eliminating the real Leonardo. We didn't get very far with that, because shall we just say, day after day after day of researching this stuff, we'd go, oh, Leonardo's in the frame. Leonardo himself is actually, And then I mean, this is a terrible thing to admit, but we weren't very sure what Leonardo actually looked like. So we got, pictures, and we thought, wait a minute, that's the man on the shroud. And that's, the face is barely touched by wounds on the shroud. It's a very beautiful face. It's the face of Leonardo da Vinci. But anyway, so then we started looking at, the whole thing, the image. And of course, the big question, if you're being objective and starting from our position, is, well, people say it behaves like a photograph. Could it possibly even be a photograph? So then we started looking into what Leonardo knew about what we would call, the various stages of photography. And he built his own camera obscura. He made his own glasses, which were, it's a long story but basically he made some blue glasses, which to shade his eyes from some experiment which was highly secret, but it involved light and heat on a massive scale. And anyway, so Clive and his brother.
So we just actually, we set out to just establish that if it's possible to make a photographic image using materials and technology that would have been available back in Leonardo da Vinci's day. And, so basically you need the camera obscura, which they had been known for centuries and centuries before Leonardo, that would actually project an image. And then you needed a way to capture an image. We automatically thought, before the invention of light-sensitive chemicals after the Industrial Revolution, that it wouldn't have been possible to have it wouldn't be possible to capture an image. You could project one, but you couldn't make it stick, couldn't fix it. But we actually found out there's actually a lot of naturally occurring or very easily produced chemicals that can be used to capture an image over a very long time, an image of a day, a couple of days or something like that. But if you're doing an image of a still body, that's not a problem. And so we set out to prove that it could be done. This me and my brother Keith. And eventually we did. We produced our own shroud, just a head image, because we didn't have a lot of space to work with, and that had all the characteristics that people hadn't been able to explain about the Turin shroud. It was more realistic when you took a photograph of it and looked at the photographic negative. It appeared to be scorched onto the cloth rather than painted. The image on the Turin shroud, the reason we can see an image isn't as you would normally expect because something's been added to the cloth, as with a painting. It's actually because something's been taken away, that the fibers of the linen of the cloth have been degraded and discolored. And that's what forms the image, and that's what did in the replicas that we made. And that's the only way you can produce an image like that on the Turin shroud, is to use a process like we did, using materials that would have been available to Leonardo da Vinci. Plus, you need the added ingredient of a genius who could come up with inventions and techniques centuries ahead of anybody else. And then the other giveaway, as Lynn said, is being the practical joker, putting it sort of in its least heretical way. He was a heretic. He wasn't a believer. That Leonardo used his own image for the face, his own face on the shroud. So we came up to with the conclusion. This was the first book we ever wrote back in 1994. 1994 it came out. And we took a good 4 or 5 years of research on this. That the Turin Shroud is a 500-year-old photograph. The Turin Shroud is a 500-year-old photograph by Leonardo da Vinci. And then it's not even that. The Turin Shroud is a 500-year-old photograph of Leonardo da Vinci.
Yeah.
It's a selfie.
It's a selfie. But I mean, but the thing is that, I mean, over the years, we've had a lot to do with big exhibitions. Certainly the few years after our book came out, and certainly after the carbon dating. And I've guest curated a couple of big exhibitions, one at the Royal Photographic Society and one at the National Media Museum. And the centre point, they're both called The Unexplained, these exhibitions. And the centrepiece of both was the shroud. And what they did, I mean, this is actually better than seeing the real thing, because they built a specially built light box to fit I always get this wrong, not the negative, what's
Transparency.
The transparency, I always get it wrong. Yes, the full length transparency of the shroud. So it's huge. It's actually huge. But certainly in the National Media Museum, they had it had its own room. There was nothing in it except this, and it was low, so people could come in and look down on it from all angles and spend as long as they wanted. You know, unlike the real thing, there wasn't a huge queue of pilgrims, you know, shuffling along, and you couldn't really see anything. You could spend as long, you know. So I would spend time just sort of listening to what people said, and just sometimes chatting to them and saying, you know. And what was really interesting was they didn't have to know anything about the details. They didn't have to know anything, but they would, just using their own eyes, come up with things. And one of the things that they said was, the man's very tall, isn't he? We proved it, actually, that the man on the Turin Shroud is 2 heights, which is kind of impossible to start with, because it's the image of the image of him in the front, and then it's sort of hinged at the back, and there's a whole image of him at the back. At the front, now this is where you'll come in handy, because I can't do metric measurements, so I'm afraid this is going to be imperial measurements. But the man at the front is 6'8", and the man at the back is 6'10". So I mean, that's very, very tall. I mean, that's giant, you know, that's giant. Also, it was pointed out by a small child, which of course, I mean, of course she was brilliant. She looked at the image and she said, why is his head too small? And why is it on wrong? Because it's slightly like this, and it is too small. And there's a line under it. You know, so we realized as we continued to research that Leonardo made it in 3 stages. The head, which is his, and there's a line here, and then the front, and then all of the back. And presumably, well, one hopes, he used the corpses that he had made available to him for his anatomical research. I mean, you know, also there are very clear, I mean, so, you know, Jesus wasn't beheaded, as far as we know. The line here, you know, is very distinct. He also wasn't a giant with 2 different heights. So from an absolutely commonsensical visual perspective, this couldn't be Jesus, but it can be a projected image, or 2 made projected images, because a projected image can be any height. You know, so and also if you think about it and you look at the image on the shroud, it's quite clear it never covered a body. It's, you know, I mean, it just didn't. You know, the people have tied themselves in knots trying to explain, oh, it was wrapped around and it was opened out and it was, well, of course it wasn't, you know. And the only explanation that fits is that it's a photograph, and we proved it. We were the first people ever to reproduce all the so-called bizarre and miraculous characteristics of the Turin Shroud And it was, I mean, I'm not putting down Clive and Keith's great work, but it was surprisingly easy in the end when you knew, it was remarkable. And just giving ourselves a little bit of bigging ourselves up a bit, because although when Clive summarized our findings, they do sound completely mad. The 500-year-old photograph by and of Leonardo, but it certainly appealed to the BBC, who and there was a chap called David Frost, Sir David Frost, who is in the subject of the movie. Oh God, I've forgotten his name. Frost Nixon, and that David Frost, and he was big name over here as an interviewer of international, politicians and things, and we had the opportunity to tell him about this. In fact, I worked for him for a while, so I got that opportunity, and he loved it. And he went to the BBC, and he personally pitched this story to the BBC, and they did our first documentary. Well, we've done loads since, including National Geographic and various things. But it's interesting how things go, because that first documentary for the BBC, it was, obviously they had to get other voices, other people with other opinions on, and not a single person would even sort of say that could be even halfway right. But fast forward to the early years of this century, and as I said, we did a documentary for the National Geographic, and there were loads of experts saying, well, yes, we could see Leonardo would do that, and we could see that he could do that, and that is really, so it's obviously sort of circulated in the mindset somehow in the unconscious. But it's been tough. It's been tough because obviously it's a very sensational idea or a sensational theory. But we also discovered evidence in Leonardo. I mean, this was since our book came out. Evidence in Leonardo's painting that he was at least, shall we say, intimately connected with the shroud.
Yeah, our book came out actually over 30 years ago, but there's been new editions with updates on as we've carried on our research. And then for us, we always had the thing that we could build this circumstantial case. We certainly could, absolutely sure it's a photographic image. The connection with Leonardo was kind of circumstantial, what it looks like him, and he's in the right place at the right time, And
we had quite a lot of circumstantial evidence.
But we didn't have a kind of smoking gun that actually would link him directly with the shroud. And then it came along in the early 2000s when they discovered this lost painting of Leonardo's, the Salvator Mundi, the Saviour of the World, and which is the only painting that Leonardo made supposedly of Jesus looking straight out as the man on the shroud did. He doesn't look anything like the face of the man on the shroud at first glance, but we thought, well, let's just try mapping one onto the other and just seeing how the two compare. And we were astonished, because when you take the two images, face of man on shroud, face of the Salvator Mundi, overlay the two images on one another and make the top image more transparent so the one below shows through, they match absolutely perfectly. Not only that, but physically the two images, the painting and the one on the shroud, are actually exactly the same
dimension,
size. So this, and as we always say, this doesn't prove that Leonardo created the Turin shroud, but it proves basically they were in the same room at the same time. Or more likely, in some ways, Leonardo painted himself in the Salvator Mundi, and it's like the man on the shroud because it's him.
Yes. Also in Salvator Mundi, Jesus, in quotes, Jesus is holding an orb, a see-through orb, which meant obviously to be, because it's Saviour of the world, meant to be the world, but it's actually a quartz crystal. And we believe that Leonardo used a crystal lens in his his camera, his camera obscura.
Yeah, because the glass wasn't up to it then. It was,
and so
all lenses wasn't.
So actually, it's cheeky. That's here am I. This is me. And And the thing is, of course, what was he doing? Putting himself on the shroud. He was making himself Jesus. So there he is, in the Salvator Mundi, Jesus with his lens.
There's a few little clues actually in the Salvator Mundi as well. So it's almost like we call it his confession.
Yes.
He left it behind so that people would know.
I mean, people have said, oh, well, why shouldn't Leonardo have been in the same room as the Turin Shroud? Well, true, except that Leonardo was famous in his lifetime. And if he'd been in the same room as the Shroud as a believer and, and thought, oh, this is amazing, he would have told people he was famous, or somebody else would have told people as propaganda for it. But no, this is obviously very secret. There's some connection between Leonardo and the Shroud that is a secret, and we know what it is. Yeah. So, I mean, people, by the way, inevitably, whenever we mention Leonardo and the Shroud, there's always somebody who says, oh, but the Shroud was around 100 years before, at least 100 years before Leonardo was born. That was a different one. That was definitely a different fake. Yeah.
Yeah. But the earliest we know that the Turin Shroud, as we know it today, existed is 1516, which is, just very, very late in Leonardo's life, wasn't it? And although there are written accounts of this relic that go back to the late 1300s, they're only written descriptions, and even some of the main champions of the Shroud, being the genuine article, acknowledge that there's no proof that what is being written about is the same Shroud that we know today. And what's interesting with that early relic, it was eventually it was in the possession of a minor French noble family. They passed it on or sold it to the Savoy family, who were one of the big families of Italy. And then once they acquired it, this relic, this shroud, which incidentally every account written up until that point said it was a painting. Everyone said it was painted. Then the Savoy family acquire it. It disappears for 30, maybe 40 years, not displayed, nothing. Suddenly, 1494, during Leonardo's lifetime, it is then brought out again. It's displayed for the first time in a town very close to Milan, where Leonardo was working. But from that point, everything changes, and it's considered to be a miraculous image. The Pope declares it the real thing, whereas previously popes had said you can only display this relic as a depiction of Christ's shroud, not as the real thing. Suddenly it changes.
And what I like is the local bishop of the first one, he said, not only is it a painting, but I know who painted it. So in the first one, obviously, it was Leonardo's one was a substitute for that one, which just, was rubbish.
It probably wasn't very good.
It wasn't very good. And it was, And so they needed something that was remarkable. And they needed basically a magician, they needed somebody who was so clever, who could produce something that wasn't a painting, basically, But you see, Leonardo achieved something astonishing for the future, for his future, for us. Because the thing was that what we would call various bits of stages of photography, various people did experiment then with projecting images, but the Catholic Church believed it was anathema. It was wicked, and terrible punishments, were lined up for people who, for example, projected images of actors onto a barn wall, and that, sorcery, But Leonardo got away with it, possibly because he was doing it for the Vatican. But the thing was, of course, so he was using a very forbidden technique. What was forbidden then? I mean, absolutely on pain of death, and a very painful death at that. But he used it to create the ultimate Christian relic. So the joke, if you like, is that he used something the church hated in order to create something the church loved so much that they would look after it for him through the centuries, until maybe, I mean, you can imagine him hoping this, maybe one day somebody will recognize it for what it is. And here we are.
Yeah.
Quite the story.
Yeah.
I would like to return to Mary Magdalene.
Yeah.
Who was she? What do we know? And why does the church put her in such a shady light?
Well, she was a woman. I mean, that's really the answer. Well, according to, she's hardly in the New Testament by name. And sort of when she is named, sometimes it's a bit of a puzzle, and people don't really know how it goes. For example, when there's a list of women who have ministered unto the men of their substance, which, to be honest, I always think sounds a bit rude, but what it actually means is that they're rich women who have funded Jesus and the disciples' mission. When there's a list of the women, and they're by the top ones, obviously, presumably there are other women, but they're listed by name, and she comes first, always, every time. Mary called Magdalene, which is, by the way, the modern interpretation of Mary Magdalene. It's Mary called Magdalene. I'll come back to that. But also there's a difference, because the other women, in fact, all women, as far as I know, in the Bible, not just the New Testament, are defined by their status and their relationship with a man. Daughter of, niece of, mother of. Mary Magdalene isn't. She's just Mary called Magdalene. As if she's so famous that she doesn't need any introduction. Or perhaps they don't want to describe her relationship with a man. They could hardly say girlfriend of, could they? I mean, but whenever they do mention her by name, there's always an air of distaste in the New Testament about her. But by a process of joining the dots, you can work out that she actually did an amazing thing. I mean, we know that Jesus was baptized. We know all about that, but his name, or his title, was Christ, which means anointed one. So where's the anointing? I mean, where is it? We know the baptism, but where's the anointing? Oh, well, there is an anointing in the New Testament, which is being completely overlooked, which is when, as I say, it doesn't mention her by name, but you can join up the dots and see that actually is Mary Magdalene, who, with the spikenard, the incredibly expensive perfume sort of balm, she anoints Jesus. And it's interesting that, as usual, the male disciples have no idea what's going on, and they obviously think they're being really clever, sucking up to their leader, because they say, oh, what a terrible thing this woman is doing. She could sell this and give the money to the poor. Obviously thought that was a good line, and Jesus says, no. What she's done is, I mean, this is obviously a paraphrase. What she's done is amazing. In fact, her name will be celebrated wherever the gospel is preached. It's not even in the New Testament, her name. I mean, there's something about this woman that the writers of the New Testament do not like, and they can't face, but she's so important to the story, they have to have her in, and she is, after all, the first person who sees the risen Christ. But if you look at the forbidden Gospels, the Gnostic Gospels, such as the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, which is a fragment, most of which were discovered in Egypt in 1945, but some of it, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, was a century before. I mean, they were basically hidden from the early church because it was settling into its orthodoxy, and you couldn't have any documents, any Gospels that threatened their dogma. But the Gnostic Gospels are eye-opening. I mean, they're absolutely eye-opening. I mean, yes, there's a lot of rubbish in them, and you can tell that there's a lot of rubbish. I mean, they go on, they love, a very complicated cosmology. They talk about, the rings of heaven and the rings of hell and and they get carried away with all that. But once they start talking about Jesus and the men of the mission and Mary Magdalene and some of the other women of the mission, suddenly they're focused, and they all consistently tell the same story, which is interesting in itself. And the story is that Mary, called Magdalene, is a very feisty lady who is very unlike the standard, well, the image, shall we say, of the standard Judaic lady, possibly because she might have been, we don't know her background, to be honest. She certainly didn't come from a place called Magdala, which didn't exist then. But she could well have grown up or spent time in Egypt because she behaved like an Egyptian woman or somebody who had knowledge of that culture, because we're told that, it's not put exactly like this, but she flounced around town with her hair loose, which, that's wicked, but also in the Gnostic Gospels, the way she talks and the way she takes over meetings. I mean, this is quite amazing, I mean, there's one in the I think it's in 2 Gnostic Gospels. There's a sort of big meeting of everybody, and it's a question and answer session with Jesus at the center. And there's 42 questions that are either asked or answered, just debated. And of the 42, she asks or answers 39 of them. And I mean, it is, I see it as almost comical. If it wasn't so serious, some of the descriptions are in fact almost comical, because you have her, for a start, in the Gnostics, she prefaces everything she says to Jesus with this absolutely faux modest, "Oh Lord, don't be angry with me for speaking, but," and then she launches into, this great thing. And he's obviously, I mean, this might be shocking to a lot of people, but from these documents, he's obviously besotted with her. He'll just let her do, and he's always encouraging her to speak, which is just as well, because she probably would anyway. But and there she is, just in there. "Don't be angry with me, but anyway, I'm going to talk." And the thing is that, there's the men, and the men who are, just good Galileans. Oh, they've never seen a woman behave like this. You can imagine the shock horror, and they're always complaining to Jesus about her, and that's going to go well, isn't it? But I mean, there's one which I think is almost comical, but because there's this big debate going on, and then there's Philip, who is taking the notes of the meeting, and he says, "Lord, I've been taking the notes, and I couldn't say anything, and all those women were talking, especially her, and so Jesus, who's a great diplomat, he sort of says, 'Oh, good and faithful Philip, you speak up, you speak up.'" I'm sure Magdalene jumps in there as well, but anyway, but it's remarkable. But also, what's remarkable is again, consistently through several, if not all, of the Gnostic Gospels that we have access to, is the dynamics within the disciples, where there's Mary Magdalene and Jesus, who are a pair. I mean, they're a couple. That's absolutely no doubt. I mean, the male disciples go to Jesus and they say, Lord, why do you love her more than you love all of us? And you think, oh, come on, boys, really? Really? What a question. And then they say, why are you always kissing her on the mouth? And you think, what? And he manages to smooth that over and say, oh, yes, but you're loved in a different way, or all this. But it's quite clear that he and Mary are in a very close relationship, not only romantically, presumably sexually, but also, if you like, spiritually and politically within the group, because there's one bit which really stands out to me, where there she is in the meeting, talking and talking, and then she turns to Jesus and she says, why, Lord, why don't you tell them that thing that we were talking about, so that even they might understand it? And you think, oh, now doesn't that just show you they were in it together, and they were she was his inner circle, not the famous 12 male disciples who spent most of their time just not knowing what was going on. And the thing is that Peter, who is supposed to be, certainly Catholics believe, was his successor, starting the Catholic Church, etc. But in the Gnostic Gospels, Jesus, you can imagine him shouting at Peter. At one point, he really loses it with Peter and basically calls him dim and violent. I mean, he says, why do you never understand? I have to repeat everything. Why do you never understand? And yet there's Magdalene, who he says will sit at my right hand throughout eternity, not Peter. So, I mean, there's a case for saying if anybody was going to be Pope, it should have been her.
Mm. Yeah. Last question. What's your assessment on the Priory of Sion?
Yeah, it's an interesting question.
Well, it's again, we're back in that the nuanced position, because views of the Priory of Sion tend to be well, sorry, just backtracking a bit for a bit of the backstory. Priory of Sion, again, famously first came to international attention in the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, along with the Bloodline theory. But they were based on these documents that were found in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, purportedly from the Priory of Sion, that set out their history as being protectors of the Merovingian bloodline. They didn't say it was anything to do with Jesus and Mary Magdalene. That was, Holy Blood, Holy Grails add on to that theory. But it set out this whole history going back to the time of the Crusades, and a list of Grand Masters that included Leonardo da Vinci, which strange enough was when we first got interested in him. It was kind of all mixed together there. But opinions are divided between everything that is in those documents, the dossier secret, as they're known, is absolutely true, and it's the Priory of Sion exists and has existed for 1,000 years or whatever, and does protect these secrets, or the whole thing was a hoax by a couple of French guys in the 1960s. Our view, and it changed a little from when we wrote the Templar Revelation back in 1997 to when we wrote a follow-up book called Zion Revelation in 2006. That was our Da Vinci Code bandwagon book, because anyway, we'll get to that in a second. And what we concluded is, yes, the Priory of Sion was an invention of the late 1950s, but it wasn't just a hoax or some prank. It was a cover story. It was a front for other secret societies, initiated orders that have been around, not 1,000 years, but a good 250, 300 years. And so it was actually a sort of cover story for some of their activities. So it's so our view of the Priory of Sion is there's no such thing. It doesn't, or it is an invention. Well, any society exists if a few people say it does and we're members. But so in that sense, it doesn't exist. But the documents that set out its story drew upon a lot of older traditions, a lot of traditions passed on by different societies and different parts of the esoteric stream. So you can't dismiss everything they put there, but they wove it together. It's like it's misinformation, and like most misinformation, it has elements of truth in there, so that as you research it and you follow up a particular trail and you confirm it, you begin to think, that we can believe everything that's in here. And that's the trap a lot of researchers fall into. On the other hand, the skeptical side that just says, because some of it is not true, then none of it can be true. And the whole thing, you can dismiss the whole thing. And it's just these sort of couple of guys, Pierre Plantard and Philippe de Cherisy, they just made the whole thing up. But when you actually go into it, you can actually see there was a lot more people involved in it than that. And some very interesting names from French esoteric traditions were part of it. There's been some really good research by a guy called Simon Miles that's come out in the last couple of years that have identified certainly one of the people that collaborated on putting these documents together. So, but the maddening thing is, we still don't know what the purpose of these documents was. They're certainly laying a trail for people to follow, for researchers to follow. And everyone's assumed that trail leads somewhere, which is what, all the people that have come along after Holy Blood, Holy Grail, all the people that got bitten by that bug have followed it up. But of course, a trail can lead not just towards something, it can lead you away from something. And that's what we think the purpose was. It was to distract attention from certain other things. So the Priory of Sion, it's a hoax, but it's not entirely a hoax. And of course, it was after, it starred in the Da Vinci Code, that really brought the skeptics out that wanted to kind of shoot the whole thing down. Often with the same kind of logic that they would use to criticize what they would call conspiracy theories. It's the same kind of reasoning, because some of it's not true, none of it can be. But it was the Da Vinci Code that brought that, that kind of brought the Priory of Sion back into the public life, and reopened that whole debate, which we were very pleased about.
We were asked to join, weren't we?
We have been.
We have been asked to join. Yeah. We don't join anything.
Yeah, well, not the Priory of Sion, but the societies that we'd identified as being behind it.
Yes, yeah.
So we saw that as kind of confirmation we were on the right track.
Yeah.
And the other thing that when we followed this trail back through these different network of societies, way too complicated to go into, but we found that actually started with a particular Masonic order back in the 1750s that claimed to be a descendant of the Knights Templar, and it was a particular order that. Instead of lodges, they set up priories, and like the Masonic lodges, they're normally named after, either they have a particular name. In this case, it was named after the place where they were, and there was actually the one this all started from was actually in Sion in Switzerland. So actually, having started with the Priory of Sion, which we decided was a fake, we followed the trail back, and we actually ended up with a Priory of Sion. but not the same one. So even there's a little kind of hint in there. So that's what we think. It is true and false at the same time.
Yeah. Like life, really.
Like everything. Yeah.
Like everything. Yeah.
Yeah. But you can't trust anything that comes from them.
No.
You have to, like everything, you have to check it out.
Yeah. Yeah.
You can't mistrust everything that comes from it.
No.
It makes life hard, makes life interesting, but really frustrating at times.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, Lynn and Clive, I appreciate it, and I thank you for the history lesson.
Yeah, no, well, thank you.
Thank you for asking.
Yeah, thank you for having us on, and good luck with everything.
Yeah. Thank you.
Too. Tusen takk for at du hørte på Bendiksen Airways. Dersom du har tips, kommentarer eller vil gi en vurdering av episoden, så gjør gjerne det. Det setter jeg stor pris på.